Our closing plenary is entitled The Role of Dignity in Achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this session is co-sponsored with Global Dignity. And again, we'll give them a round of applause. I want to give special thanks to Cynthia Guyer, the Executive Director of Global Dignity, and Alana O'Donnell, the Home Office Director, for their partnership and really bringing this very important session together. The speakers will reflect on the deep connection between the concept of dignity and the Sustainable Development Goals. They'll also think and share with us how a greater focus on values can accelerate the momentum towards reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. During the session, we expect that the vital role education and young people, like all of you in the audience, really have to play in embracing this challenge will come to life. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the session, Ruchira Gupta, founder and president of Apne App Women Worldwide, which is a grassroots Indian organization working to empower girls and women to resist and end sex trafficking. She'll be speaking with Jeffrey Sachs, University Professor and Director for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and the Right Honorable Michaëlle, former Governor General of Canada and Global Dignity Honorary Board Member. Please give a warm Gabelli School welcome to our panelists and our moderator. Please join us on the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here to listen to something which is very vitally important in our world today, the idea of dignity in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I know you've been in long discussions about each Sustainable Development Goal, and how the UN is meeting to achieve them is something that you all know. And how are we going to achieve it is the question that my panel today will address. That if we have to make the Sustainable Development Goals a success, then what are the vital key ingredients in that? My own journey in understanding what sustainability is, of course, began just being born Indian in a country where Gandhi was born a century before me, where he talked about sustainability as the only way to save human civilization. And he simplified it in his own persona, where he brought it down to minimizing how he lived, what he wore, what he consumed, to the point that he gave up his turban, the shawl that he wrapped around him, the long dhoti that Indians wear, and started embracing just a loincloth, because he wanted to use the minimum of resources in the world. And slowly he began to use that in every single thing that he did to minimize the space that he occupied in the world. And he always said something very much connected to sustainability, that there is enough in the world for human need, but there is not enough in the world for human greed. And that, of course, is the basis of sustainability. Today's topic, of course, is the role of dignity in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the word dignity itself is such an important word. What does it really mean? Does it mean self-respect? Does it mean nobility? Does it mean just having a sense of worth? And there are different definitions that you will find for the term dignity. But again, going back to Gandhi, I think that dignity to him meant dignity for the self. But if you have dignity and self-respect, you have to respect the other. And it is both internal and external. And it affects every single action, thought, and how we move about it. I want to also tell you a little bit about myself so that you know who is the person moderating this very august panel. I am an activist. I teach at NYU. And I used to be a journalist. I still write extensively. And my own journalism took me into a village in Nepal, rows of villages in Nepal, which had missing girls. And I realized that there was something wrong. I began to look for the answer to where the girls were and found they all were being trafficked and smuggled across the borders of India and Nepal to the brothels of Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta. They were mostly between the ages of 9 and 13, and they were locked up in little rooms and raped by 10, 15 men every night for 4 or 5 years, till they were completely consumed and then thrown out on the streets to die. So I realized that something which I had thought was in the past, in the 19th century, slavery, had come back in a new form, and I called it sex trafficking. It existed in my lifetime, my generation, my country, my world, and I wanted to do something about it. I made a documentary, won an Emmy, and quit journalism because journalism itself felt very limiting. And I felt dehumanized watching the process, and I wanted to reclaim my own dignity by making sure that the women and children I saw reclaimed their dignity, because I saw an interdependence in our dignity. And that's how I ended up setting up an NGO, Apne, which means self-action in Hindi, with 22 women in prostitution who basically wanted to save the lives of their daughters. And one thing led to another, and today it's a bigger organization than I anticipated. It supports more than 20,000 women and children in India to organize and fight for their rights. And for each of the sustainable development goals that you're talking about today, from the right to education, the right to safe and independent housing, to the right to access justice, and of course, decent work, but most importantly, the right to be free of gender-based violence. There's a sustainable development goal called SDG 5, which is about gender equality, and in that there's a 5.2, which is that we can live in a world which is free of trafficking of women and girls and violence against women and girls. So this became integral to our work as we began to move forward with the women and girls. And today, my NGO, of course, works in the grassroots in India, but I mentor many survivors of prostitution in this country, America, and globally as well, and sit on the boards of different organizations to see how we can achieve a world in which no girl or woman is bought or sold. And again, the Sustainable Development Goals are integral to achieving this. And what lies at the center of achieving these Sustainable Development Goals is the concept of dignity. And before I hand over the mic to Michaëlle, who will talk about our own journey and how she sees dignity as an integral part of meeting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I'll just tell you that there was a moment in the United Nations when, the United Nations realized that the way they had defined goals earlier was wrong. They had called them the Millennium Development Goals, in which they had said that we will reduce poverty by 50%, we will reduce maternal mortality by 25%, whatever. So they had created these percentages of achievement and called it the Millennium Development Goal, rather than actually creating an aspiration which would be based on achieving it all. Because if you don't even have a high aspiration and you already lower the threshold, you can imagine what can be achieved. And what they did was they created a framework which was also very limiting to achieving any goal for humankind. And that was called the SMART framework, which was specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time-bound, which many of you in business schools know about. What it did was that it forced most of the people working in the development sector to choose product-based solutions which were only results-oriented and which could be numbered, counted, and catalogued in a time-bound manner. So they never thought about holistic change, which was long-term and which was intergenerational, and think about things which would affect the entire planet and ecosystem of some development. And which is why the goals began to fail, and the UN then shifted to something called the Sustainable Development Goals. In my own case, for example, where I was working in the red light districts of Calcutta, there was a goal by big foundations to reduce AIDS in India, and they targeted what they called high-risk behavior. They hired McKinsey to develop a plan for them, which was a condom distribution plan. And they hired pimps and as peer educators and brothel managers to distribute the condoms. And basically this top-down approach, product-driven approach to deliver X number of condoms in X number of months, time-bound and all of that, ended up empowering the sex industry at the cost of the girl. Because the entire aim of the program was to protect sex buyers from disease rather than protecting the women and the girls, and the sex industry increased by 17 times. So that is why today it is important to think about human dignity when we think about sustainable development goals, because nobody thought about the human dignity of that 13-year-old girl who I call the last girl. And with these opening remarks, I would like to hand over the mic to Michaëlle and ask her to speak about her observations and her vision that how do we achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and how do we keep dignity at the center of it?
To answer, first I want to, as I'm looking at you, I want to say how honored and how privileged I feel being with you this evening. There's nothing like a university. It's a space, a safe space for thoughts, for ideas, and it's wonderful to be able to share that moment together. I think when we talk about dignity, first of all, bear with me. My first language is not English. I grew up speaking French and Haitian Creole because I was born in Haiti. And I speak 5 languages, but at the same time, if you see the screen before me, it's because sometimes I don't want to stumble on words, and don't bear with me if sometimes I go to, my notes. And well, what I want to say is that I have experienced and known both ends of the dignity spectrum. I have been called the Right Honorable Michaëlle Jean, Excellency, since 2005 when I became Governor General and Commander-in-Chief of Canada. One could say that's one definition of dignity, this high responsibility, honorable place, elevated rank, for someone like me who wasn't born in Canada. I arrived in Canada as a refugee and a migrant, like many families and Canadians. And that experience of exile, forced exile, has shaped me, definitely, because of all the challenges that it implies. However, I learned about dignity much before I was elevated to such rank. I was taught about dignity through my roots, by my mother, my grandmother, my history. And I think it's important. The struggles of my ancestors matter to me. And those struggles really taught me about dignity. Abducted in Africa, put on inhumane cargo ships. My ancestors were enslaved. They were enslaved for over 4 centuries in Saint-Domingue, the former French colony, that is now the Republic of Haiti. Slavery is, and I'm happy that you raised that, because slavery is the very definition of what dignity is not. Dehumanization, humiliation, degradation, objectification, torture, rape, repugnant exclusion and abject labor exploitation, absolute poverty. All are fundamental violations of dignity. In my country of birth, dignity had to be conquered. Dignity came through resistance. It came through struggle. As we fought for and created the first Black Republic in the world, the people of Haiti's absolute quest and journey was about dignity for all. The intrinsic value of human beings who should never be treated like mere objects, things, inferiors, beasts of burden, means to an end. My grandmother, a widow, single mother who worked endless hours on her sewing machine to raise her 5 children and send them, boys and girls, to school, has taught me about dignity. My mother who very courageously fought the bloody repression of the Duvalier dictatorship, and then, like many, was forced to flee, found political asylum in Canada with her 2 children, had to start from scratch. And she never complained. There was something in her that gave her that energy to really, you know, resist to everything. My mother was, I would say, my greatest teacher about dignity. She had to beg for jobs. She was a professional, but she had to beg for jobs. Then she would teach other immigrant women how to read, write, and count so they could know not only decipher the small paychecks, but also daily exploitation. I would like also to salute the women with whom I spent a decade building across Canada the largest network of shelters for women and children fleeing domestic violence. The women I saw rebuild their entire lives. They too taught me some of the greatest lessons in fierce dignity. So needless to say, I have faced many moments in my life where I put these lessons of dignity to good use, how to maintain one's own sense of self-worth, as you said, in the face of injurious behavior. I could also tell you about my life as a young woman facing more than her fair share of abuse. I could tell you stories about my years in journalism and what we as women faced with some of chauvinistic and xenophobic male management. My own daughter, she's now 20, she just turned 20, also taught me about dignity, how we have to replenish and rebuild our own sense of dignity every day as Black women. I will always remember her coming home and saying, you know what, Mom, I feel like sticky labels were put on my skin. And I have to pull them off one by one every night. For a child to say that to you and asking, why do we have to heal our skin every day? So dignity is based on our intrinsic value, but dignity is also a struggle. Dignity is resistance to all forms and manners of indignity. And to me, just to conclude, and as we move to the SDGs, dignity is an action verb. Dignity is about also taking actions. Yeah.
I would now like to ask Jeffrey Sachs, who I first met at the Vatican, where he advises the Pope on ethics in action. And we were talking about the vulnerability of people to being trafficked, especially sex trafficked. And Jeffrey had invited me for that consultation when we met. Today I would like his observations on where do you see the role of dignity in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? Especially, you're such a world-renowned economist, you write a column which I read every week on the issues which are troubling our world, this polarization, this intolerance, diminishing resources, climate change. How are we going to hold on to our dignity when everything is sort of pulling us in different directions?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to Fordham for having us here for this discussion, and thank you all for coming this evening and participating in the discussion of the SDGs today. The Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals before them are based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is our moral charter of the United Nations. It was adopted in 1948 by all countries, and it remains today both an inspiration and an unfulfilled dream. So like many of our tenets of belief and ethics, we know that we live in an imperfect world, but we strive to make the world better. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on the idea of human dignity and human rights to political, civil, economic, social, and cultural dimensions of our life. The first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Dignity comes even before rights. The idea that people are worthy of respect and moral treatment is the first point. Out of that arises human rights, the rights to things that we need to stay alive, that we need for our personal freedom, that we need to achieve our human dignity. It goes on to say they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I think that that says a lot. I wouldn't agree with your characterization of the Millennium Development Goals. I was the advisor on the Millennium Development Goals for 15 years for the Secretary General. It was absolutely in the spirit of dignity and in the spirit of the Universal Declaration that those were proposed by Kofi Annan. I think rather brilliantly, actually. He proposed them at the beginning of the millennium because the world does not pay attention to the poorest people. And the idea of focusing global attention on the world's poorest and most vulnerable people was not a denial of their dignity, it was an attempt to rescue them from death. And the Millennium Development Goals accomplished a phenomenal amount. And nobody defended human rights more than Kofi Annan. So I think that it's not, shouldn't be seen that way. It's also not right to say that they were limited or inadequate. Just to give you an idea, I was both the advisor on the Millennium Development Goals, the senior UN advisor. They called for cutting extreme poverty by half between 1990 and 2015. But I also wrote the book, The End of Poverty, which called for ending extreme poverty. I said by the year 2025, 14 years ago, which would have been an achievable date had we tried harder. Instead, that goal was adopted for the year 2030 under the SDGs. But the idea of quantified objectives with a time bound doesn't mean that you're not trying to accomplish all. It just means that you're trying to actually set a path that is very bold. And the Millennium Development Goals called for many bold, quantified objectives, reducing child mortality by 2/3, reducing maternal mortality by 3/4. Yes, they were attacked by people who said, why not go the whole way? But these were with time dates on them. It didn't say we should have as our end goal, as our purpose, a half reduction of poverty. It just said by a certain date, something should happen. And the Sustainable Development Goals are a follow-on to that because the Millennium Development Goals were seen as successful in focusing attention and resources. Mind you, not successful the way we would like, just more successful than would have been the case without them. This is a very difficult world. It's not easy to get people to pay attention to these issues. Do you think Donald Trump pays attention to these issues? I can assure you, no. Absolutely not. So we're trying to put attention on issues that lack power, support, resources. We're trying to draw attention to the most vulnerable and poorest people in the world. I worked with the Vatican to help get in the statement about ending all forms of modern slavery, part of the SDGs, because we're trying to go for the core of what needs to be done. But it's a very hard world. It's not hard to achieve these goals because we don't have the means to do it, or because they would cost too much, or because we lack the know-how. It is mainly a question of attention and values. Maybe not even values. I would say the absence of putting values into practice. The absence of what the Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom in decision-making. The corruption of our political systems, which is very severe in this country and in other countries. We didn't end up with Mr. Trump just out of nothing. We have him because our country is in a profound political crisis that is a crisis of corruption. Money buys politics, and we ended up with a person who is personally profoundly corrupt, which is even worse and more dangerous for our country. So we have a huge moral crisis, which is our biggest challenge. That's why Pope Francis is so important and completely correct in Laudato Si to point to the ethical underpinnings of our own survival, after all, which we're not even good at. You would think we'd at least know how to save ourselves, but we're so disconnected from basic values now that we don't even know enough to save ourselves from climate change or from other ills, because everybody's too busy chasing money or chasing other false objectives, and not with the reflection or the temperament, the temperance to do the right thing. So indeed, I would say fundamentally in the Sustainable Development Goals are the values of dignity and rights. Rights mean that everybody is entitled as human beings to health, healthcare, to education, to safe food, to a safe physical environment. It seems so obvious, but it's not fulfilled. It's shockingly not fulfilled. Not in our country, which is so rich you can't even imagine, yet people struggle for the most basic ability to get by day to day. And in the poorest countries of the world, people struggle for their physical survival each day, and millions of people die of poverty every year on the planet. And that's what the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to rectify. Now, it is in many ways a big challenge to achieve these goals, because you're trying to change the way the world operates, and trying to do that in a way which engages the whole world. Because for many of our goals, like the climate safety, this cannot be accomplished unless the whole world works together on this. And that is definitely not happening right now. And for the poorest people in the world, the goals cannot be accomplished unless the rich help the poor. So unless the injunction to clothe the naked and feed the hungry is actually observed. And this, again, is not the case. So now we have some very specific objectives, and they are quantified, which is not a diminution of dignity. It's a way actually to try to harness real resources, real time-bound efforts, a sense of urgency which is needed to actually make some important changes. And the challenge is to get this large-scale action on the basis of these objectives. So I can give you a very quick report from the front lines, because this week is the UN General Assembly week that has reviewed where these goals are and what needs to be done. The interesting fact is that the Sustainable Development Goals are now deeply embedded in government planning and declarations all over the world, and they're rather deeply embedded in corporate reporting and rhetoric. So these goals that were set in 2015 are alive. They're still there. More than 100 world leaders spent the last 4 days talking about them. There were thousands of participants discussing, from the companies to the scientists to the heads of state to the diplomats, what to do about these goals. That's the good news. The bad news is that the actual progress is very limited and mixed because of a few points. First, unfortunately, our country is in a terrible political crisis. The impeachment of Trump is, or the impeachment proceedings, I'm thinking ahead with glee. The impeachment proceedings against Trump are much needed because unfortunately our president is a really mentally disordered individual. I'm sorry to say it, I'd be happy to elaborate, but I know I'm following very closely our public policy events, and we have a real crisis in this country. That gets reflected in the lack of global action. President Trump was the second speaker at the General Assembly of the heads of state yesterday morning, the traditional position of the US, and he gave a speech that, if anybody cared what he said, would be horrifying, because he basically said, we don't care about the world, we only care about Americans, you care about yourself, and that's the beginning and end of the story. It's worse than that because he said, you care about yourself, we care about ourselves, and we don't like this country, this country, this country, this country, so we also reserve the right to crush you, which is actually what's going on, because American sanctions policies are actually starving several countries right now, Venezuela, Iran, and other countries, which is extraordinarily in violation of basic human rights, in my opinion. So we don't have the political leadership of the most powerful country in the world. We have quite the opposite. That's a major problem. And the second point that I'll just emphasize, because I think it's quite important, is that these are complicated goals. So to carry them out requires a tremendous amount of organization. And even on the AIDS example you gave, we can discuss and debate many things. You know a lot about that subject and do wonderful work in that subject and in that area. But I don't think the motivation is what you said, actually. I don't think the motivation was to make sex safe for clients and so forth. I think the motivation was to protect people against transmission of the disease and to try to break the transmission of the disease. Whether it's the right way or the wrong way, I think the motivation was a good motivation. I was the person who first recommended the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and helped design the program. And many of the things you were talking about are funded by that program. And by and large, it saved a lot of lives. The estimate is 27 million lives saved over the life of the Global Fund from 2002 until 2018. But the work is not simple. It requires more resources than the rich give. It also requires a tremendous amount of organization and expertise, and no doubt mistakes are made also. There's no doubt about it. But stopping a massive epidemic disease is not an easy thing also. And we're trying to battle several of them right now. without too much help from the powerful countries. So this is another aspect of the challenge is organizational. One has to design programs that actually could deliver results, mobilize resources, convince governments to be engaged. It's a lot of lifting in a very noisy world that lacks the will to do it by and large. But at least this week, I'm not feeling so down on our world or so pessimistic. First, I'm very happy with the impeachment proceedings because I think it gives us a glimmer of hope. But I think that also what I've seen all week in discussions with the heads of state around the world is that there's a lot of engagement, more than one would imagine, and a lot of young people engaged. And Greta Thunberg did a wonderful job of calling attention to these great challenges, and what she said resonated around the world as well. We're not lost. We have Pope Francis, we have Greta Thunberg, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have the Church's social teachings. That's a lot of strength on our side. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Lot of food for thought, from the politics of the day to the inner workings of the UN and how the Millennium Development Goals came about and what were the challenges that world leaders faced when trying to chart it out, and also my own observations and a broader perspective on what I was talking about. So thank you for that. I truly appreciate that. And from the grassroots, of course, sitting by a little girl in a brothel, what you actually see is something bottom up, whereas what you saw was top down. And what I saw was the pimps and the brothel keepers being empowered by a program funded by the Gates Foundation and God knows how many other foundations. And if I would just tell the police that such and such brothel keeper is holding this girl hostage, they would say, but that brothel keeper is a peer educator for a very powerful program, and we cannot arrest him. So for me, that was my perspective, that while it had...
a very valid perspective.
I know you always have taken on board what I've said. So I do agree that it was unintended consequences. And to make the goals more sustainable, the bottom up and the top down have to meet somewhere and take into account the dignity of every single person, and absolutely the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable, which the Pope is talking about, and that is why he's a moral figure in the world today. So harm reduction along with harm eradication is very important, and very often while people like you are thinking that everyone understands that, those implementing on the ground do not. So they just think, I have to get this condom out of the door, I'm going to work with this pimp, get access to the brothel, and do this. And so something gets lost in translation. And that is really important to think about, because I think that's why dignity becomes central. That if everyone used the means of dignity to achieve the end of the Universal Declaration goals or the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals as a center point or a fulcrum, that will this give dignity to the person I'm interacting with? Am I thinking about the girl or just the men who are buying the sex? We'll be able to think about dignity for all, and we'll be able to come to a balanced way of doing things, because the means are the end. In fact, the end is embedded in the means. So, Michaëlle, do you have, I want to give you more time to explain through your own experiences.
Listening to Jeffrey Sachs, I could feel your sadness. I think as you were talking about the political crisis in your country, and you know that it's troublesome for I think, the entire world. I think it becomes a challenge for us all, and you're saying the world is a very difficult place. Nothing is easy. But I believe that we have in our hands something that is very powerful. It's revolutionary. It is that notion of dignity and shared dignity. Can you imagine, not too long ago, it wasn't even something that you could imagine, even in this country. Shared dignity. And about the SDGs, there's a huge ambition, right? When you go back to the words, even the SDG declaration, you know, to say we resolve between now and 2030 to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. We resolve also to create conditions for sustainable, inclusive, and sustained economic growth, shared prosperity, and decent work for all, taking into account different levels of national development and capacities. And then you hear a leader saying and talking about shithole countries, and you go, my goodness. What is happening? Knowing that to actually reach these goals, we need to come, you know, together like never before. And you hear that, and it's an offense to people's dignity to hear something like that. I remember my reaction right away. I thought there are no such things like shithole countries. There are circumstances, there are conditions, there are realities. But how can you, at the face of humanity, say something like that? Yes, it is troublesome. It is very troublesome. But I think as we embark on this great collective journey, and the pledge is that no one will be left behind, recognizing the dignity of the human person is fundamental. We wish to see the goals and targets met for all nations and peoples and for all segments of society. But there's something actually that seems to me, and I'd like to hear you about this. When we look carefully at the 17 SDGs, there's one gaping hole, I find. Nowhere is democracy stated as a goal. Democracy meaning citizen-based participation, strong counterpowers with freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and so on. So how can we make stronger connections between global dignity and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? And instead of talking about reduce inequality or combat inequality, why not seek to end inequality itself? Why not combat and eradicate all forms of discrimination? We should aspire to that. It should be an ambition. So while the SDGs clearly aim to put an end to hunger and an end to poverty, how can you eradicate them both, hunger and poverty, without eradicating the current systems based on inequality?
This is your question.
Yeah.
And just 5 minutes, because then we can open it up to students to ask questions.
Yeah, I think there are really reasons to believe that we can have societies that are fair, but those societies won't be equal in all income and wealth. That was tried in the 20th century. It turns out that to achieve that kind of outcome, or even to try it, requires such a repression of individual activity that you end up, if a goal is complete equality, you end up with the real tyranny. So, and you don't end up with real equality either, because we're all equal, but some are more equal than others, as the expression goes. So the Khmer Rouge or Mao or Lenin had the idea of complete equality, and that proved to be beyond what we could achieve in a dignified way and in a prudent way. But what is true is that there are places in the world that are providing everybody's needs with a high level of dignity and with a very high level of social cohesion and in a democratic way. And the best exemplars of that are the Northern European countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. They're the closest we come. They have the lowest level of inequality. The so-called Gini coefficient is the lowest among all countries in the world. The happiness ranking is the highest in the world. The progress towards the SDGs is the highest. So to my mind, they are our best cases of how to combine many, many different objectives in a very, very powerful, impressive way. And I would take that as the best we're going to achieve. Remember that even in Plato's Republic, which was our first utopia, it was a pretty harsh state, actually. Not necessarily a place you'd like to live in, because to get that equalization was a very regimented society. So I think that the goals are not wrong in that way. When it comes to democracy, many of the countries of the United Nations are not democratic countries, and these are universally agreed goals by all the governments. So a term like democracy would not be a term that would be accepted in a loose way, not even in a loose or even a rigorous way, because many countries, first of all, unfortunately, the US has launched many wars against other countries saying, you're not democratic, we're going to make you democratic. And the Iraq War was fought under those circumstances. Of course, it caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and much suffering. So one of the tenets of the United Nations is you don't interfere in our internal affairs. And at the same time, though, all countries are to adhere to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there's a kind of balance. And in China, which is not a democratic country, now the Chinese government's rhetoric is that they're moving to democracy, and they talk about democracy by the middle of this century. They also say don't interfere in our internal affairs, but for a reason that we should also appreciate, which is that the last time, quote, we interfered in China's internal affairs, China was invaded several times. Britain fought 2 wars with China in the 19th century to force China to take opium from Britain. So that was the British idea of freedom, was the freedom to sell opium to the Chinese. They didn't want that, so Britain fought the First and the Second Opium Wars. All of the big powers, including the United States, asserted rights in China to extraterritorial law. In other words, we will be in Chinese territory, but we'll determine our own law. Japan invaded China in 1931 and brutalized China for 14 years. So the Chinese view is, don't mess with us right now. We're getting better, and we don't want your internal interference. And I respect that to a significant extent, though I also would insist that China is a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So one should understand that this is a political document that was negotiated by all 193 countries. It reflects that fact. There are other things missing because some countries, want certain things, others didn't, so this is a consensus document. But it's a pretty impressive consensus, actually. It's a workable document focusing on ending poverty, social justice, gender equality, which a lot of countries don't necessarily follow that legally, but they signed this, and environmental sustainability, which is urgent. And finally, just to say, what is in there affirmatively is reducing, well, one goal is to promote the rule of law, ensure equal access to justice for all, that's goal 16.3, substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all forms, that's 16.5, reduce illicit financial and arms flows, strengthen the recovery of stolen assets and so forth. So there's a lot in there about the rule of law and about ending corruption and impunity, and that's all very good.
Thank you. And as Professor Sachs said, that gender equality is so foundational to everything else, because even democracy rests on that. It's at home that we first realize that it's all right for one class of human beings to order and one to obey, and one to get paid for their work and one not to get paid for their work. And into that trench, all other hierarchies fall, and we begin to normalize hierarchy at home. So I'm glad you mentioned gender equality as a very important sustainable development goal. And I'd like to open up the floor to questions. You've heard some very important observations on the sustainable development goals today. Yes.
My name is Honorary, and I have a question to Professor Sachs. I'm Polish, and when I was a student of economics, you were the first name the professor when change in Poland from communism to capitalism happened. I want to address the question of dignity and change. In a sense, all those goals we talk about are very big to reach, and they will need shocking changes in many countries. And in the shocking changes, there's a lot of unintended consequences happening. Like you gave an example of India. In Poland, this shocking change created a class of underprivileged, of poor. There was lots of people who kind of lost their dignity when they worked in a communist country, when they went into the market economy. My question to you is what we should do different this time to minimize those negative consequences when challenging ourselves, having the ability to go in those actually higher to the top.
Thank you. I'll take three questions together so that, yes. Thank you. One more question, and then I can ask. Are there any more questions? I can't see from here. Yes. Can you speak loudly? I'll ask Michaëlle to speak first, and then Professor Sachs.
To me, dignity is not abstract. It is a condition, a basic condition, I think, for in a very human approach and vision of life. Let me give you an example that is very concrete and very pragmatic. I was in Haiti just last week again, supporting the efforts of rural communities in their endeavor to engage in agroforestry. You know, Haiti is a place where there's a severe problem of erosion. And when I saw these peasant associations and cooperatives working so hard, so proudly engaged in growing, harvesting, fermenting, and really revitalizing the environment. And everything, it's like some very strong, robust efforts to safeguard and revitalize economic ecosystems, all good for rural development in Haiti, and rolling back the climate crisis. And I saw the results, and what they were saying is, how come there's no investment in these efforts? How come there are no investments in this human capital that we represent? We are making change happen. We are contributing to the growth of the country. We are contributing to human, economic, sustainable development. We are doing this with all our knowledge to better living conditions. And what they are saying, and this is what dignity is about, is how much their lives and their children's lives should matter. This is a call for dignity and respect. How much their rights and freedoms matter. How much they would like to be considered in a very inclusive approach as being part of the solutions and being part of a local, national, and why not a global plan for human development. You see, and they do that. That question stays in their minds on an everyday basis. And this is how I believe the private sector can come as part of the solution also. Making the right investments to actually consolidate and reinforce these efforts that are happening in so many countries and in communities who deserve to be recognized, who deserve to be accompanied, properly. One thing is happening also in the world, the populations have changed. When some say, don't interfere in our affairs, whose affairs are we talking about? People are very connected. They know what is happening. People are brilliant. They know what's good for them. They know, and they want to see their aspirations heard and considered. So where do we put the balance? The affairs of a group that wants to keep the power in their hands, or the aspirations of people who really want to live in dignity, and are putting so much efforts in that. I understand that we have to come to a consensus, but at the same time,
it's not just that. It's more complicated than that, because the claims of "we're going to save you" have been so misused by power in this world.
I know.
So it's more complicated than that. These are the humanitarian appeal was the appeal for overthrowing so many governments by the United States.
Yeah.
So that's why it's more complicated, because statecraft cannot be based just on that. If it is, it gets misused terribly. And that's a practical problem.
The challenge we are having now, the majority, the youth, for example, has never been so, comment est-ce qu'on dit, nombreuse? So numerous, I mean, numerous in humanity than now. You have countries where 70% of the population is under 25, and they have dreams.
Of course.
They have dreams, they have visions, they have
you.
passion.
I'm just talking
what are we
about
going to do?
intergovernmental or geopolitical processes cannot be based on these appeals of how one government acts against another government. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Because you end up with a real, you end up with a lot of opportunism, which is you claim, I'm going to do this for you, but you're really doing something that is pretty awful, which is what happens when powerful countries claim to be acting on behalf of others often.
No, that's not where we want to go.
Right.
Do you want to answer her question?
Yeah,
Yes.
I want to, I wouldn't do anything differently because it's really not actually like you think. Poland just had the best 25 years in its history of the last 300 years. The only time of quiet, peace, democracy, and substantial economic growth. When I began working in Poland, people were breaking down on the streets because there were no goods in the shops. There was a hyperinflation, and the literal fear was that there would be hunger and civil war within months. That was 1989. They had 45 years of communist rule, which had led to a complete destruction of everything. No. And I spent 3 years fighting for Poland's debts to be canceled so that Poland could get a fresh start. It was said at the time that we know how to turn fish into fish soup. That's what the communists did, but how do you turn fish soup back into fish? And the fact of the matter is Poland did brilliantly. Did everybody thrive? Are you kidding? At the end of 45 years of communist rule in a broken, bankrupt economy? Everybody? No. Did Poland's living standard, life expectancy, quality of life, freedom, happiness rise significantly? Yes. And in 1989, Poland was 30% of Germany's GDP per capita. Now it's 65%. So in a generation and a half, Poland has closed half the gap, which is extraordinary. So I don't know if I'd have the guts to make the same recommendations now, but they actually worked. And that is, whether it's luck or not luck, you know, you don't get perfection in this world. And I can tell you from the starting point, what occurred was unimaginable. How quick and peaceful, I understand, but I was asked a serious question. Yeah, no, I just want to answer it properly because it's a point often made and I think often misunderstood, actually. In terms of the question of dignity, I was actually the person with the government of Bhutan to negotiate the framework of happiness for the UN General Assembly, and I co-published with John Helliwell and Richard Layard the annual World Happiness Report. And it's having a beneficial effect because it's leading more countries to think about what those data show, why people are suffering or not suffering, and what can be done. And I think that it is, I personally think that this is in the spirit of dignity. Dignity means enabling people to have what they need to be able to thrive. That's their rights. And everything about the Sustainable Development Goals are based on these rights, on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And fundamentally, as I read to you, that conception is based on dignity even before rights. It's the idea that every person on this planet matters, and that every person should be respected, and that every person should be able to advance. And finally, on the question of business, business is key. A lot of the good results right now are many businesses doing good things to try to align with the Sustainable Development Goals. Our problem is a number of businesses that make a lot of money that are not aligned. They're making a lot of money doing dangerous or adverse things, like pumping oil and gas when we know we have to move to renewable energy, or making foods that are unhealthy, or making other products that are unsafe, or buying products from the Amazon while the Amazon's on fire. So the main challenge of business is alignment with the principles of the Sustainable Development Goals. And fortunately, there's a lot of work underway to create the metrics and the monitoring to be able to judge, is this business actually aligned with the SDGs? That's really a core step that's underway right now.
I'll let Professor Sachs have the last word today, and now you can talk more to the participants outside. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry.